Well, Fuad Azadi is a professor at the University of Tehran, joining us from Iran's capital. And also here in the studio is Zidane Al-Kinani. He's the founding director of the Arab Perspectives Institute. And also with me is Al Jazeera's diplomatic editor, James Bays. Thank you all for speaking to us here. James, I want to start with you because just a few hours ago we were talking about these diplomatic talks ending in Pakistan, but somewhat, there perhaps a bit of optimism that at least they managed to get two sides talking. Now this post from Trump, what does that mean really for any diplomatic channel? And does that mean that he could follow through?
Well, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean diplomacy is over, but it means that he has decided to put pressure on to try and change the answer of those in Tehran who were just a few hours ago in Islamabad. Really quite extraordinary what he's decided to do to get freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. He is launching a naval blockade. In other words, in an effort to open the strait, he is now closing the strait.
Quite ironic, really, isn't it?
It is amazing. Illegal as well under international law. The US hasn't, as Iran hasn't actually ratified the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, but it it does agree with most of its provisions, which are international, customary international law. And so doing this is illegal, but then again, launching with Israel the attack on the 28th of February was illegal, as was Iran's response hitting the Gulf countries. All of those things are legal under the UN Charter. Also calling on other countries to join the blockade. How are they going to respond? His close allies that have rebuffed him already once when they didn't help him before with the war that they were not consulted on at all. I wonder whether they had any consultation this time around, that they're being obliged to join this naval blockade, because of course he's also said that the US military is locked and loaded and at some point will finish up what little is left of Iran. His words, not mine. So those countries, if they're asked to join a naval operation in the Strait of Hormuz, not only is it that itself illegal, they'd have to join the war that they've all said they don't want to join.
I mean, what sort of countries could he be referring to, do we think?
It's a big question what countries would come forward. There are lots and lots of countries that want the Strait of Hormuz to be open. And in fact, the UK, one of his closest allies, but one that's had strongest tongue lashing in recent weeks, with its leader Keir Starmer being told he's no Winston Churchill. It tried to do something on this. It got together a coalition of about 40 countries to at least attend a meeting by some in person and some on a video call. But I don't know if they were prepared to take part in Donald Trump's military operation. Clearly, they're going to have some difficult calls in the coming hours with the White House and the Pentagon.
And certainly Europe has refused to take part in this war. They said it's not their war. I'm going to come to you, Fuad, because again, we were speaking earlier, talking about the distrust. The Iranians have come back. The Iranian Foreign Ministry saying that there is a complete lack of trust towards the US, even though they had discussed many of those points. What now with this major threat on the Strait of Hormuz? It was the one card that Iran has been able to use throughout this war as leverage.
We have to wait and see what happens. As you know, we have had Pakistani ships, Indian ships, ships from France. We had a couple of Japanese ships going through. So once they go through the Strait of Hormuz, would they be stopped by the United States? We just have to wait and see whether Trump is going to actually do what he's saying he is going to do. And one reason many of these countries are not going along with Trump's demands, because he has been asking Europeans, NATO, others to help him with the war that he has started. And I think one of the reasons they're not accepting his invitation is because they know that he's going to be around for another 3 years. His presidency is going to end. we are being optimistic. There are some people in the United States that are looking to invoke the 25th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, ending his term earlier. But if he finishes his term in 3 years, then he's going to go out of the White House. Iran is going to be here for many, many years to come. And Iranians will remember what happened to them while Trump was president. You know, this is the second time we have a blockade. In 1953, we had the British blockading the Strait of Hormuz because they did not want Iran to sell oil, because Iran had nationalized, this is Mohammad Mossadegh's time, Iran had nationalized the Iranian oil. And in order to prevent income for Iran, for his government, for Mossadegh's government, they blockaded Iranian oil. This is 2026. I don't think he's going to be able to repeat the British experience in 21st century, but we just have to wait and see.
All right, and Zaidan, do you think that the GCC is going to be very concerned about this? And I say that because just earlier today, Qatar, in fact, opened its maritime waterways within the country, allowing vessels, all types of vessels, to go back on the water and operate. It may have to recall that, if that's the case, if there is this security threat coming from across the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh, yeah, most certainly. The continuity of this war is a direct security and an economic threat to the GCC. Hence, they have advocated for an end to it, even advocated for it not to happen from the first place. Just imagining the economic crisis that this has reflected upon the global economy, then we can't imagine what would happen to the region that is facing the Strait of Hormuz. We also imagine economic implications that will take time to overcome, even if this war were to end, and also depends on how it would end, depending on the militarization aspect of it. But if we were to look at the development and the way the US has reacted towards the Strait of Hormuz, it reflects a very obvious mindset within the Trump administration, where they were heading towards the talks in Islamabad, arguably based on discussing so many files and issues that were believed to be unresolved issues either for decades or for years. But it seems like it was fully focused on the Strait of Hormuz, given the fact that there is a consensus regionally and internationally that this has been a new political leverage given to the Iranian political leadership following this war. As our colleague James rightfully mentioned yesterday, it took the JCPOA years to negotiate for it to happen, and then revoked later on very simply by Trump's first administration. And now the nuclear program or the nuclear talks is only one issue amongst the very long list of points, which undermines the notion and the idea of J.D. Vance and Trump's administration's rationale behind that. It's enough for the delegation to be there for only a few days or a few hours to negotiate issues that have been unresolved for decades.
And James, is it unrealistic really from the US, or perhaps this is an intentional post to put that pressure on Iran, because it's barely been 24 hours since those talks ended, to then come out with such a huge threat and very bombastic language there? A
huge threat, and I have to ask, what is he trying to achieve with this naval blockade? Clearly, pressure on Iran, and Iran will feel it because it is taking some money on some of those ships that are going through, are paying a toll to Iran, and Iran is getting its oil out of Karg Island. But of course, the main thing that Iran has had as a weapon during this war is its economic leverage from having the strait mainly closed. Well, that is further strengthened, actually, by Donald Trump. The economic damage to the US and the world will actually be increased by this, and we'll have to watch very closely when the markets open. Is there another objective for it? Is he preparing the ground, perhaps, to actually take Iran's oil resources? There's been much speculation about a possible plan to take Karg Island. This blockade is perhaps the sort of thing you would do if you were preparing to have the Marines do that, to control the strait. Certainly you do need to have significant military forces, possibly on Iranian soil, because remember, as you go through the Strait of Hormuz, on the Iranian side, there's a mountain range not far away. They have the high ground, so you need to control.
It does give them a vantage point.
It does,
Iran.
exactly.
Fouad, I want to come over to you because, when we look at this Strait of Hormuz, you have Karg Island, which is a huge economic benefit to Iran. How prepared do you think Iran will be for a scenario like this? Because Donald Trump, according to him, he says he's, in his words, decimated the Iranian Navy. So what will Iran do if such an attack does happen?
That would require ground troops. He has already bombed Karg Island a couple of times. If he wants to take over Iranian oil, as James is suggesting, then he would need ground troops to do it. That would increase the number of U.S. soldiers who would lose their lives unnecessarily for the war that he and Netanyahu started. That would put more political pressure on him. I think the gas prices in the United States will increase if he carries with this objective that he has. So he's going the other way. He should be doing something to reduce gas prices, and he shouldn't increase the number of soldiers that have been killed already. So the hope that I think Iranian leaders have is that this is another rhetoric, that he gets up in the morning and he does these tweets, and then by nighttime he does something else. So the hope that a lot of people here have is that this is the normal ranting and nothing serious. Yeah.
And Zaidan, I want to ask you, when we look at the Gulf region, obviously Qatar, which was one of the mediators when it came to the situation with Gaza, and it has also been a mediator for the US when it came to Afghanistan, when the Taliban, during the Taliban issues between the US and Taliban. Now back to this, Qatar is not involved, obviously, in terms of negotiations, but it will be involved in terms of having perhaps the US ear. How much influence can this region have to prevent any such attack from happening or any further escalation to this war?
It depends on the outcome of this war. It depends how far does the Iranian political leadership, if the current leadership and the current regime were to stay in power. It also depends on how much the US influence were to remain here, not just militarily, but also politically and institutionally. There may be a lot of conversations, there may be a lot of reassessments, not just towards the future relationship between the GCC and the United States, but also the future relationship between the GCC and Iran. There's two schools of thought here, one referring to deterrence and one referring to more diplomacy. In this case, we're mostly referring to the perspectives from Oman and Qatar and the perspectives from the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Maybe Saudi Arabia a bit more careful than the UAE, given that Abu Dhabi was obviously targeted more physically from the Iranian attacks. But there is also a very long-term imagined vision that many observers may believe may be on the table, where the GCC has realized that those 6 different sovereign polities, despite their diversities and their opinions and their approaches and their interests, long-term and short-term, their security and their existentialism is much more collective and common than one would even imagine. And this war has been a great example, given that the Iranian attacks and the Iranian targeting of the national security, of these different national securities of the different GCC states, was a major evidence of how these attacks can undermine all of them, despite their different relationships with Tehran.
Of course, and undermine regional stability. That's all we have time for. I'd like to thank you, Fouad Azadi there in Tehran, and Zaidan Al-Kinani here on the studio, and of course, James Bays updating us the latest, our diplomatic editor there.